Thank you for 4 wonderful provocations. I now no longer know what I'm supposed to do at all. Career change. And so for the next 20 minutes or so, we'll have a debate with each other. You will have a debate with each other, and then you're all invited, obviously, to come up, and we'll have microphones running up and down to ask questions.
I've got one to get the ball rolling.
Okay.
So, Jack, I admire the optimization and efficiency to which you strive, and I think it was an elegant talk. But I look at the pictures as a linguist, or as a retired linguist, or whatever it is that I am, and they're odd. So you might have, for example, mother, pregnant, and murder together. And I wonder, what is that? Is that an artifact of a particular story, and they were all involved in that story because they know they're moth stories? Might not be as simple as that, but what I really want to know is, what are the causal mechanisms underlying how we represent language? I don't think those words are processed in the same way. And I'm not sure you can do better if voxels are your inputs. I mean, voxels have lots and lots of neurons, but I wonder whether all of this sort of PCA-ish kind of stuff is getting us to what the causal mechanisms are. Like, I have trouble imagining causal mechanisms by which those particular sets of words are kind of uniform at the same grain level, common representational. You get the idea.
Okay, first off, remember the first law of neuroscience is the brain doesn't care what you think about the brain.
Granted.
Okay, does whatever it does. Couldn't care less. I'm not sure what you're talking about as far as a causal mechanism goes. I mean, these people are alive, therefore they have brain activity. That sounds causal to me, so you must mean something else, I'm not sure. But the point is, MRI purely produces maps. That's all it does. MRI is a mapping technology. If you don't have a mapping question, then MRI is actually irrelevant to you, and you shouldn't even pay attention.
I mean, maybe that's, Steve Pinker once had a great line, one man's reductio ad absurdum is another man's modus ponens. And I think we just saw a version of that. So
one person's signal is another person's noise. It's a classic thing in science, yes.
I go back to the thing that I started with, which was Conrad Cording and Eric Jonas's paper. I think that's their point, is that you can do these kinds of mapping techniques, and it doesn't tell you, you do these mapping techniques, I feel like you're not paying attention, and
we already know what we want to say.
Am I allowed to use my theory of mind up here? Okay, good. So I'll finish the question, and then you can. The point of their paper essentially was you could do these kinds of mapping techniques, and they did emulations of them with respect to the 6502, and that it wouldn't give you the things that a computer scientist would call the causal mechanisms. There, the causal mechanisms are known. I mean, you could certainly talk at the electron level, but I think it's reasonable to talk at the microprocessor level, the gate level, and so forth. This is how people build software, and I wouldn't want to get rid of that. If you want to get rid of that, we're going to have a tough conversation, but you take it away.
So my biggest thing with that paper, and I wrote a blog post about it, was that the fundamental difference, well, there are many differences between a computer and a brain, but one of them is that a brain has structure, and nearby neurons are often doing the same thing, whereas the internal components of a computer can be essentially rearranged. We could write the addresses in completely backwards, and it would do the same thing. There is no structure to the way a computer is run, and so when you
wait a second. Hold on. I need to keep my wallet here. You can physically permute some of it, just like you can physically permute a neural network.
There's no reason that something next to something else should be doing the same thing in a computer. There's no reason.
So, but the structure does matter. You can't permute random transistors in a computer and still have it work. I mean, you can swap any 2 transistors, but you can't swap the wiring diagram of the computer and still have it work. I mean,
but there's
what level
no reason
are you saying
that any 2
structure?
things next to each other are doing the same thing at any time. I mean, you can use them in different ways in different programs.
I would also add that the main difference between a 6502 and a brain is the software and the hardware are intimately linked in the brain. And
I want to come back to that,
but
I want to hear Eve first.
Well, the question I would ask is whether using the 2018 methods where you can record, let's say, from 20,000 neurons at the same time, if I were to use optogenetics just is using all of today's modern technologies, which would be multiple neuron recordings and multiple and different perturbation methods, like optogenetics or stimulation through those electrodes. The question is, I suspect you do a lot better at figuring out how that little circuit worked if you could do what Rafael Yusta always says he wants to do, which is to record from every neuron simultaneously. So I think the real question is not when that paper was written, whether the methods of that day were instructive, but how much better you do today.
I mean, it's not that old is the first thing I'd say. It was last year.
It was a long time ago in
It was
terms
in
of...
gestation for a while.
No,
I mean,
no,
look,
it's a long time. If I'd say, if you could record simultaneously from 20,000 places, you're going to get much more information about the interactions, the potential interactions, or how data or how signals were traveling.
seeing how we're on the same team here nominally, I don't know if people could even figure out the teams. I'm going to agree with you on part of that, which is I think the perturbation is really key. At the same time, I think it's a challenge for the field. They laid out their data, their simulation. I think they'll share them if they're not, on some directory you can download. And it would be really cool to see if somebody could do optogenetics or do neuropixels or whatever they want in their favorite analytic technique and actually induce how the microprocessor works. So we have two issues here. One is, what do you need to add to the toolkit that they had in order to figure out a microprocessor, which is a great question. The other question that's coming up is a kind of nihilism that I'm not going to accept, which is like, well, there's no structure in the brain, or in the computer, or the structure in the brain are different or whatever. Like, I think the techniques that we use should, in fact, probably at least roughly work on a 6502 and a brain. If they don't work on a 6502, I do think we should be worried.
I'd like to take my privilege as the host and ask, what each of you actually consider to be an explanation, because that seemed to me quite different. So for instance, we're debating about let's say the minutiae of whether my transistor is here or there, but what actually counts for you? When would you say, I have understood this circuit or this phenomenon or this behavior, I've in fact explained it? And it seems to me that everybody has a different view of that. I think Jack is on the prediction side of things, and maybe even more on the mechanistic. But can you speak to that?
I think I would be looking for a set of 2 or 3 sentences that explained how it was that the thing actually did what it's doing. Now that demands that that you have a way of figuring out what it's doing, which is not always obvious in certain parts of the brain, right? So a lot of what's happening today in neuroscience is people are trying to come up with descriptions of what a piece of the brain is actually doing. And I think that is probably one of the hardest things for many parts of the brain. And maybe you can get that from imaging or maybe not. In the old days, you got it from lesions. But I think we still don't have a good explanation of what it's doing. Now, with that microprocessor, presumably, it's a bit tricky because some microprocessors could be doing very many different things if they're embedded in other structures. So, or maybe not.
What I like about the microprocessor is the way in which you can map between levels of explanation. So you can describe what's going on at the transistor level, what's going on at the gate level, what's going on at the arithmetic logic unit level, all the way up to the operating system level and so forth. And you can build very precise mappings, and you can support counterfactuals too. You can say, if I knock this out, this is going to be the consequence for that. That's what I'm looking for. If it's simple, that's great. Modern microprocessors, not 6502s, are very complicated in terms of how many transistors they involve. So you can give a general explanation. To describe the detail would be very complicated. Or for Ma's last theorem, you can't give a one-line or two. So there are cases where there's something explainable, but it's complicated.
So do you think if you had theory, you could use brain imaging techniques to understand a microprocessor? You took theory at the same time.
I think brain imaging techniques of the fMRI sort are of too coarse a resolution to be able to do that. I don't.
And so that's the main problem you have with that paper, is that the resolution of the imaging on top of the microprocessor is too
Well,
coarse.
that's a really interesting question. So if you could do things, and it relates to the challenge I put to the field, if you could do things that are more equivalent to at the individual transistor level, and you could do the perturbations, so you could do the equivalent of logic probes. I mean, in the limit, you ought to be able to do that. And the question is, like, what analytic techniques do we need to support something like that?
I think, with all due respect to the authors of this paper, I think they made a very provocative title for a paper whose title should have been Neuroscience is Hard. And I have seen them talk about this several times now and gotten my pants in a bunch about it because I think the title is just obnoxious. And every time they end up backing up and saying, well, we just meant to say neuroscience is hard. And I think, like, I did physiology for 20 years. I know neuroscience is hard.
I think they're saying more than that.
Tell me this.
I think that they're saying it's hard in a particular way.
I think they're saying neuroscience of a 6502 is hard in a particular way, and I don't doubt that. It's also irrelevant.
Think the brain is easier, or you just
If
think
they,
it's
if
so
they
far
had
off
given
that?
this a fair test, like using an ASIC, a fixed circuit, at least that would have been a fair test.
I mean, 6502 is a fixed circuit.
It's the software and the hardware are independent in a 6502.
You-
That's the whole point.
So
if
you-
they had done it at a level of finding the math registers, the memory units, in other words, not the transistor level, that
theory.
actually probably would have worked.
Well, no. I mean, they tried to do
Which
that
is
and
the
couldn't
level-
find that. I mean,
No,
there was no evidence.
Because they only did it one way. They didn't use a neuroimaging version.
But I guess to do
it's
that,
all
they would have
irrelevant.
had to have a theory that that's there. So
No, they could have just done multi-resolution imaging, right? But I would actually like to get back to
This
David's.
is the key question here, is could you, in a purely bottom-up way, determine those kinds of things? Forget the software level. Could you, or use it however you
In
like.
a 6502, who cares? What difference does
Do
it
you
make?
think the brain is easier? I'm still a little bit
No,
confused.
but that's the point. Let's
Do you
spend
okay,
all of our
different-
calories thinking about the brain. It's really hard.
All right, let's try this a different way. Do you think
Can we get back to David's question?
Yeah. So you should answer it now. What's the causal link you're looking for?
I said already, I want the levels of mapping between different levels of description. Or, sorry, I want the mappings between different levels of description. That's what counts as explanation. The question I was going to ask is, can you get there from bottom up? That's the critical
I
question.
think you can, I think it's pretty clear from those of us who've been working on small circuits for a long time that you can get pretty far if you go very carefully level to level to level to level, and you do very badly if you try and skip steps. And the problem is, so I know exactly what I would have to do to tell you how many ion channels of what types contribute to the dynamics of a single neuron. I can't do it necessarily for every single neuron, but I know how to do that. I know how to describe synapses and then explain how those synapses alter the dynamics of the cells that they're interacting with. I know how to do that up to a certain point, and then when circuits get big, it's not clear what changes when things get big. And that, to me, is one of the really confusing
I
questions.
totally appreciate that, but I would give as another example from the history of science was Mendel identifying factors, which of course turned out to be genes, where it was based on top-down considerations, and then when people found the appropriate molecular mechanism, they're like, oh, this maps onto that. And so sometimes the famous Pasteur quote is chance favors the prepared mind. The theory can help prepare the mind.
So I think in terms of, you know, the kinds of multi-electrode recordings that people are starting to do now, with, without optogenetics, et cetera, on the dynamics of larger circuits, the recipe is more there now than it was 5 years ago.
Agreed.
But I still think it's not, so what's missing is a disciplined explanation or theory of how densely you have to sample a circuit in order to have enough data. So I think, I mean, I would say that you know, obviously, if you can record from every single neuron in a circuit at the same time, that gives you one kind of data. If you can only record from 1 out of 10, depending on how many instantiations there are and how many cell types, that may or may not be enough. And so that is one of the really big questions facing neuroscience, and that's probably where theory can be very helpful.
Well, enough. When you say we don't know if it's enough, you mean enough for a theory of everything, right?
Enough to give you an idea of how the dynamics of the circuit
Right.
arise
So
from the underlying structures.
In practice, in neuroscience, we've learned again and again and again that it's not necessarily worth worrying about how much more data you need, because you always need more data, right? You always, our tools are so measurement limited that we've never reached a point in the sort of mesoscale, the transneuronal population level of neuroscience where we thought, oh yeah, I've got enough data to really figure this out. And I completely agree. Actually, I think the limitation is data. We don't know how much data we need. And frankly, if we could record from every single neuron in the brain today, we wouldn't know what to do with that data. Because that would open up all these other interesting non-dynamical systems math problems that we have never solved because we've never had the data to do it. It would be a great problem to have, though.
Yeah, but I can record from every neuron in my 30-cell circuit, and we have plenty of data, and there are still some dynamical systems problems that require theory that we don't yet have.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes.
So in your, that's a case where you have all of the data and you still need theory. And you don't really know how much data you're going to need. You don't know when there's going to be a device that will enable you to record it. You don't know how much theory you're going to need to apply to a piece of data that you don't have yet. So all we can ever do is muddle through as best we can, recording whatever we can with the highest quality possible and making progress that way. Now, David asked an interesting question earlier, which was, what do you consider an explanation? I'm the ultimate pragmatist, so I have a very defined view of an explanation. I measure something with some device under some conditions. I want an explanation whose dimensionality is lower. I want an explanation whose dimensionality is lower than the measurements. It would be nice if it's an elegant explanation as well. That accurately predicts outside of set, meaning outside of this situation that I measured. If I have that, I'm happy. The smaller dimension that explanation is and the more elegant it is, the happier I am. The reason I don't like deep networks as explanations.
Can I ask you what's your criterion for elegance? I can sort of derive what a criterion for small is. But, but I can't derive what a criterion for elegance is.
Well, that's a real subjective, phenomenon, right? Small tends to be based on Occam's razor. Elegance tends to be traditionally in science based on considerations like symmetry and things like that. But one of the problems with deep networks is they predict really, really well. But a deep network fit to any data set will actually have dimensionality larger than the number of measurements. So it is an explanation, but it's not an explanation that any scientist would ever like. And the only reason those explanations exist is because engineers have to build a thing that predicts, because they're trying to solve a problem, and they fundamentally, solving the problem is more important than solving the problem elegantly.
And the proof of that putting in there, I agree with you, is the poor generalization that they get going offset. You push them far enough out of the training set, and the quote explanation doesn't work anymore.
So does almost every cognitive model we have. Because people don't test generalization.
I suppose it depends on the domain that you're talking about. One thing I mentioned in a Medium article in January is people said, well, machine learning can't do extrapolation. And I pointed to flash fill in Microsoft Excel, which actually does extrapolation just fine. It sets the problem up in a different paradigm.
The main methods for testing machine learning are extrapolation. That's what we do.
They're not
That's
really.
our bread and butter. We hold out data, fit a model on a subset, and test on it.
I want to follow up on one thing just about Alona's talk, because so I liked the one-liner, kill your darlings, but suppose I kill my darling, and your recipe then is to just collect a ton of data. How do I know?
My recipe is that
But that's what this last slide was, right?
No, my recipe is we need to be cognizant of the moments where we're pushing too hard on our theory and the data is saying something else. And I think there's multiple times in the history of neuroscience where that has happened. And there's also, the saying that science progresses one death at a time. That people who hold too tight to their theories pass on, and then there's growth because there's room for new ideas.
Again, the same question as to Jack. How do you know when you're doing well? What's your evaluation metric for saying, I've killed my baby, or darling, or whatever it is? I've killed your baby and mine, and now I have a clear criterion for knowing that my performance is better because I rely more on the data. So how? Because of a better fit, or what's the?
Yeah, for a better fit. I mean, that's the thing that would.
So what I always tell my students, they come in with a model in mind or a theory in mind, and I just look at them and I say, go ask the crab. Yeah, so I mean, I think we all fall in love with our own ideas, right? This is the other way of saying that. And I think the biggest trap is when neuroscientists or scientists in general fall in love with their ideas. And because sometimes they're elegant, sometimes they were born out of hard work, but then you always have to go back and ask the crowd.
So I want to also chime into something I think Ila didn't talk about enough, which is computer science and AI used to really be a backwater of like human society. It was really, really poor methods. Most of the methods were optimized to getting money out of the military. And I saw a lot of that back in the 80s. It was not pretty. But computer science lives in it's like dog years. You know, 1 human year is 7 computer science years, and the field in the last 30 years has really made 100 years of progress, and a lot of that progress is actually in the methods. So in the 80s, what would happen is there's no data, right? In an AI system, there's no real world. You're simulating the world. You're modeling the world. You're creating something from scratch. So people would cheat. And then after 10 or 20 years of this, everyone in computer science and AI realized, hey, wait, we're all cheating. And we're not making any progress because everyone's just cheating. And we have to institute standards where we can all agree on how not to cheat. And they became the most neurotic group of scientists and engineers as far as cross-validating predictions out of set, separating your fit set from your test set. All of those methods, although discussed for decades beforehand, were first implemented in computer science. And cognitive neuroscience would do a great service to itself if they adopted methods for validating and testing models as neurotic as the ones in AI today.
I mean, I don't think anyone will object to that. We should be careful. So we're ready to take some criticisms, comments, and so on. So I think we have people ready to run around with the microphones. Maybe we'll give one to each side. So if you have a question while we continue up here, raise your hand, ask for a microphone. Who has the, okay, do you want to take that side? And do you want to take this here in the middle, maybe along the middle?
Yeah.
It would be the easiest way. So let's start over here. There and then there, yeah.
So I think we can all agree that it's a false dichotomy, big data versus big theory, and most of us think that we need both, right? But what I'm wondering about is how can we overcome a situation where some of us are sort of on the theory side and others are on the data side, and we're not really linking up the two elements that we need, right? How can we have big theories, so complicated theories like deep nets, or cognitive models that are really AI models, but then use brain data and the very rich data that we can get now with imaging techniques, including fMRI, but also to photon imaging and optogenetics and all that to test those theories?
Who has a one-line answer for that?
Well, I was actually a little troubled by something in the way you said it, because if you're trying to model to photon data or optogenetics and fMRI data, those are very different levels of organization. And mechanistically, those data mean different things. And so I guess the question is, why were you lumping them together? Because in my mind, you would be looking to build very different kinds of models and very different kinds of explanations, depending on what you're trying to ask from those different kinds of data. They give you evidence from the same system sometimes, because depending on how those data have been collected and what the animals or the people are doing, they are more or less naturalistic, more or less perturbed. So it's not totally clear to me.
Right there. If I can say one thing to that, I think your question is very good in the sense that if we collect big data, whatever big, by the way, is, no one has yet answered the question, what do you consider big? And what's bigly? And what's just small? I mean, so it would be nice to know what the criteria for that are. But I mean, your point is well taken in the sense that if we collect huge, colossal orgies of data across different levels, even from the same system, how are they linked? I mean, they're very different forms of data. And so again, that will ask the question, what are the underlying primitives, mechanisms, essentials to even find systematic relationships between that? So I don't think that's an easy one at all. I think, okay, you're up.
Martijn Jansma from Holland. I'm a fMRI researcher for about 20 years, from pretty much the beginning, and also studied physics. And one answer from physics would be big data is sometimes 3. Because I was a little surprised about the discussion about the levels. One thing that I always remember that made a big impression on me was physicists have theories about systems of 2 molecules, and it's a nonlinear system, and they can perfectly describe it. But when there's a 3rd molecule, it becomes completely unpredictable, and they don't even try, and they skip to 1,000,000, and then they have a theory of a gas, and it works perfectly. And somehow we are still stuck as neuroscientists sometimes, oh, we should understand behavior from neurons. It's impossible. Don't even try. Don't waste your time, I think. And that's why fMRI, it's so amazing. I was so amazed that you can actually say something useful about the brain with a theory on that level.
So what's the message of the question?
So I think, because something is also going really wrong in fMRI, I think. And it has bothered me for a long time. I don't agree that we got a long way in 20 years with fMRI, with the new technique. So maybe the question should not be, is it big data versus theory, but is it how can we get rid of incorrect theories and how can we prevent using the incorrect data? And in fMRI, I think we're using the incorrect data. And we're using very, very high resolution data, and it's based on very low resolution underlying data. It's smooth, it's averaged over subjects, so it's very low resolution. And we publish it as high resolution pictures. Because it's so much data, we don't bother anymore about the numbers. So we publish pictures, and the pictures are not, we don't have any rules for reproducibility of pictures. So we can get away with a lot of things. On the other hand, we throw away a lot of data which is quantitative, which is very reproducible and very interesting. It's percentages, signal chains. But you have to go to a lower resolution. And to go back to the kill your darlings, you were talking about kill your darling, kill the theory, but sometimes you have to kill your data, which is even sometimes more difficult. You have to kill your resolution, you have to go to very low resolution ROIs, get quantitative models, it's very reproducible, and then we get more theories. And I was always wondering how we get away in fMRI with publishing papers that have no numbers.
So
maybe somebody can respond.
Somebody can respond. I don't know exactly what to respond. I mean, you have to kill someone as a basis.
Yes.
Here, does someone want to give a quick?
We're in the U.S., so.
One thing I really resonated with in your question was, in physics there are these sort of quantum levels that are oftentimes unanticipated, where theories just work. And you see this even just in MRI, right? You can have a single proton theory of how MRI works, and then the minute you really start thinking about susceptibility, you say, oh, screw that. There's a billion protons. Let's think about what happens in that bulk tissue. And a lot of physics works that way, and it's quite possible that neuroscience and the neuroscience of computation will also work that way, where certain computational ideas work really well at the simple circuit, and other computational ideas work at a level that's above, say, a local circuit. Maybe they'll work at a column or something like that. And I'm sorry, Eve, but it's possible. I'm an open-minded guy. Because I don't know, in the absence of a model that works, I don't know what's going to work. So I think people have to try. I'm kind of a let 1,000 flowers bloom person. Try it and see what happens. I would feel really bad about losing resolution, though. That's the one thing I disagree.
I would just like to say that I think that the way real neurons are built provides a series of constraints on the way the brain can work. real neurons can't do all things. Now, you can maybe build circuits from them that can do a lot more things than you understand, but I think it's a mistake to ever assume that the dynamics of the brain don't depend on the biological constraints that are made by the fact that you're working with real molecules that have real time constants and that have to do whatever they have to do to stay alive.
I'm wondering whether we can ever agree because our goals are very different. So Eve, I loved you talking about the idea of having a few neurons and then going to 30 and then and having some grasp of what's happening, and then all of a sudden you lose it because you get to a place where 4 explanations work. And then I'm sitting here thinking, well, what many people in this room care about is human behavior and understanding what drives our behavior and the decisions we make and our memories. And we use fMRI as a tool to help understand maybe there are features of certain behaviors that we apply in new contexts. And I completely disagree with this idea that was just brought up that we haven't learned a lot from fMRI. The psychological questions that we're asking now are very different and have been shaped by looking at networks of brain activity, the existence of the default network. I could go on and on and on. So many things that we didn't even know existed in the human brain. That said, if your goal is to explain how the brain works, the whole brain, then I think this debate is probably a good one. But if your goal might be a little bit different, which is to understand behavior, then it's just a tool at some level. And I just wanted to put the behavior in there because I think we're missing what may be important to a lot of the people here.
Hey, I'm not sure whether it's a question or a concern. I was wondering about the generalizability that Jack proposes in terms of mapping from this sort of big data approach. First of all, it's really cool. I've never seen so beautiful brains in papers before yours, so I'm really sensitive to the color code, so that's really cool. But I'm wondering whether we can generalize this, because the space of hypothesis is much larger than the data that we can ever collect, right? And although this works beautifully for stories and narrations and all of the stimuli that you use, you couldn't have found like place cells, or you couldn't have found the neural basis of conscious detections, or this kind of things that people, or at least some people in the field of cognitive neuroscience do care about. And the reason why you cannot ask this question is that because you're trying to ask too many questions at once, right? Or at least it could be a concern. If you try to ask too many questions at once, you won't be optimally driving your signal-to-noise ratio precisely for the questions that you care about. So you could answer some questions. You could discover new phenomena, as you pointed out, with this very nice gradient between the sensory and the associative cortices. But you also won't be able to address some of the key questions, foundational questions of cognitive neuroscience. So yes, that's sort of my concern.
I was with you till the last sentence. I certainly agree that you can't have it all, right? There's no free lunch. And there's always trade-offs. And any MRI experiment is going to be determined by the number of bits of entropy in your stimulus and your task, the number of bits of entropy that you get at the end of your measurement device, and the number of trials you have. And you can allocate that signal any way you want. And so you can get a lot of information about a small thing, or you can get a little tiny bit of information about a big thing, but the amount of information you have is a constant. So you have to make a strategic decision about whether you have a really good hypothesis that you care about, or you're more like me, that you're skeptical that perhaps all the hypotheses you have kind of suck. I think if you have a good hypothesis and you have convinced somebody to give you money to test that hypothesis, first of all, congratulations for that. Always a challenge in this environment. Then you should, the classic methods were developed for that, and that's the thing you should do. That's about it.
I'll even give you the mic back in a second. I'm still thinking about your pretty pictures. And I'm wondering the relation between the labels that go on any one of those, I don't know if voxel is the right word, but areas, regions, and how people actually use those words. So for example, one thing I could imagine using your model for, I think doesn't work, which would be to predict confusability things. So people do confuse family relationships when they make semantic errors, but they don't, say the word murder instead of the word father very often, maybe in very select circumstances. So I'm guessing that on the whole, if you did the predictions for confusability ratings, it wouldn't work that well. So it's not, even though it looks sort of like a theory of confusability, it's not that. What is the causal mechanism that are involved, let's say, when I parse a word mother, and what would be the relation between that and one of the regions that you identified? Like, the problem that I'm worried about is getting from the format of data that you have, which is kind of like these averaging and predictive things, and the causal mechanisms by which I would build a computational mechanism that would say parse a sentence. Like, I don't see how to bridge the gap.
I get the feeling you just don't like the brain. That's my theory. Because, the bottom line is the brain's a bunch of maps. There are a bunch of maps hooked together to other maps. In recurrent circuits, every map has a 50% chance of being connected to every other map. It's a horror show of maps. These maps are not even static. They can be modulated by attention. Nobody has any concept of how you go from this system of maps to cognition, right? That's a big leap. So you have to have some assumptions. If you have some assumptions about what you would expect to see in your cognitive model in maps.
Let me ask. Let me take a turn, just for 1 second, and then we go here, and then we go there, and then we go over there, and then there. Did you actually have a hypothesis about language processing when you did these, and so how do you interpret the maps? So when you do.
They're not about language processing. They're about semantics. They're about meaning.
Well, did you have a hypothesis about meaning?
We did not have an explicit hypothesis about meaning. What we had is a statistical natural language processing model of meaning, which is a different thing. In our earlier work on movies, we actually did have a hypothesis about semantics in movies because the model we used for that was WordNet, and WordNet is a hand-built model that instantiates a theory about the hierarchy of objects in the natural world.
Mm-hmm. So you have to buy into that particular model to interpret that map. So, okay, last, and we have to go back.
So I'm not going to put it in the frame of a question to Jack, but to the audience. If you were a psycholinguist, would you think that maps are sufficient as the computational mechanisms to explain something like parsing, interpreting, natural language understanding, or so forth? Like, I think maps are part of the answer, but I think they're also part of the problem. We're doing all of this cartography, but I think we need some other computational mechanisms that know what to do with maps and maybe, for example, make compositional representations with them.
Okay, now we have.
They might.
Take a brief.
They might look like tree manipulation operations like the Dahan paper.
Before it gets physical, let's have a question from here.
Hi, thank you to the chair and thank you to the panel for organizing this. This has been really interesting. I've been enjoying it. My question is a little bit directed at Gary, but I'd also be interested in answers from Alona and anyone on the panel. Personally, I do believe in things like representations of abstract concepts or abstract representation of concepts, logical inference, causal models. So the question is, okay, on the one hand, there's the accusation that you cannot get those out of the kind of like CNNs that we're having. And, okay, because yeah, then I was going to say, it's like, doesn't it look like some of the like Griffiths and Tenenbaum hierarchical Bayesian models are actually being able to pull out some of those structured representations and possibly even causal models. So, and I feel like, I mean, there has to be some kind of bottom-up way to build that up, unless, my apologies, you have like a really hard innate knowledge theory that you're going with, which, anyway.
I missed the
okay,
question.
I guess that's the end of my question. But well, the end is, what is, if you can just build it up this way, maybe the ways that we feel like we think about it, logical inference, causal models, abstract representation, I mean, what if they're epiphenomenal?
Right. So I think my big problem for what Gary's pushing for is that when, as a computer scientist, what I think about is, okay, so I need to sit down and I need to implement these primitives. And if once that happens, there will be assumptions made, and they could be flaws in the system. And so I think being able to learn how to do the things that you are suggesting with your primitives is probably the best way. It's probably not the best way in the short term, but I think in the long term.
Clearly, I sat on the wrong side, but now I'll use it for custody. No. So I'm just going to quickly refer people to a couple papers. 3 papers. Lewis and Greffenstedt's at DeepMind had a paper very recently called Learning Rules in Noisy Data, which was about why you want to innately have representations of variable binding and so forth. It's very consistent with what I've argued for, but from a very different place. There is my own paper on innateness, AI, and AlphaGo, which lays out hypotheses about innateness. And then after both of those came out, there's a paper by Luca Bonatti and others in Science last week suggesting that young infants have precursors to logical reasoning. So that collection of 3 papers that came out all in 2018 can give you a sense of why you might actually want to have some of these structures innate and not all learned.
Quick questions, quick answers, because we have to go to the consciousness instinct soon. So hang on, we're going around. So Brad, quick question.
Yeah, question / comment, and I wanted to pick up on the comment from over here, is that Eve Marder showed an example of how you can have degeneration. You can have physically distinct circuits that implement the same function. And the notion of degeneracy makes sense because we know that those circuits implement the same function, which is to say that we understand the representational level. We understand the ontology that ultimately, presumably, allows us to explain behavior. And I think the doom here really is for the bottom-up approach, because the bottom-up approach has to both solve the problem of the bridging assumptions that the issue of degeneracy makes clear, and it has to solve the problem of the relevant ontology at the representational level that we'll use generatively to explain behavior.
Exactly.
Well, I agree with that. But,
okay,
you know,
we have agreement. Right here.
Acknowledging,
Very nicely put. Okay.
Acknowledging the problems is not the same as offering a solution. Everything sucks. The question is how to make it better. And you know,
Okay,
you
but
can
it-
come up
it-
with a
it
million
sucks-
proposals
it
for how
sucks a
things might
little
get
less.
better.
After that point, it sucks a little less. So okay, Micah, quick.
Yes, it is quick.
Quick fire.
Binary question. Do we have a grasp of what is signal and what is noise? And if so, what is it?
Yeah, I thought we said one person's signal is another person's noise. We actually have, well, if you, I mean, I don't, there are several papers published on how you determine signal to noise in neurophysiology and MRI that I'm happy to point you to. To first order, the stuff that is repeatable and systematically related to something you have manipulated is signal, and everything else is noise. Now, the problem is that everything else might be of interest to somebody else, and it might be potentially explainable variance in another situation. So signal to noise is always relative. You just have to do the best you can. It's like everything else in MRI. You just do the best you can.
Okay, now things get interesting. The penultimate question. So the stakes are getting high.
Okay, so the stakes
In
are
the
high,
maps
so
I
I'm going to
showed,
use...
it was literally the same thing. It was repeatability of signal to single words versus repeatability of signal to narratives.
That's in the supplementary materials. You can see it.
So since we're near the end, I'm going to go ahead and refer back to some questions that have been asked earlier and not maybe answered quite. One of them was, it seems like each of you has a different favored level of explanation, right? You want the explanation to be at that level. And when we talk about mechanism, usually what we're talking about is moving one level of explanation down and explaining it in terms of just one level, not 15, right? And you know, there's the famous Churchlin and Sejnowski image going from, you know, molecules all the way to behavior, and we have many levels in between. And so my question is, would you guys agree that the two of you who are on the theory side in this argument, as far as I think we started with, are trying to think about things at levels that have been approachable for many, many years. So Eve's looking at the individual cell or just a very small number of cells, and we've had a long time to look at that. And then Gary's looking at, I mean, I would argue, based on what you've said today, that your favored level of explanation is psychology or linguistics, right? And we've had a long time to look at those things. But the other two are somewhere in the middle, and we haven't had as long to look at that kind of thing. So it seems like a lot of the distance between these is how long we've had to look at these questions and whether the theory has naturally been built yet.
I appreciate
maybe it's how recently you've read David Marr, maybe.
I appreciate the psychological analysis, but I would say that in my case, although I certainly have fondness for the psychological level, what I'm really interested in is not the levels, but the mappings between them.
I like your summary. I think everybody has their own level of ambiguity that they're comfortable with, and people naturally float to that level in science. I actually prefer single neurons, but in humans it's hard to get them. So for my human work, I use MRI, but you know, I'm constantly driving down the gradient of resolution. I think all levels are important for measurement because you don't know which are going to be important for explanation.
Can you?
Well, Eve looks at, yeah, well.
Well, we cheat because the behavior of the animal with regard to the functions that we work basically maps almost identically onto the behavior in this. So we've collapsed some of those levels. That's why it's been so useful.
Hey, we come to the last question in which someone will be killed or something.
Okay. Sure. Thanks. This has been a lot of fun. I think an alternative title for the session could have been, and perhaps this sums it up, is not necessarily big data versus big theory, but especially where language is concerned, which data and which theory. Okay, so especially for meaning, I'm coming back to Jack and Gary's interchange about narrative and meaning. It really does matter. The primitives do matter. We don't have the flexibility that we have with cats. Hubel and Wiesel did some sad but good experiments on cats that describe the primitives of the visual system. We don't have that for language. And figuring out what those primitives are and the theory that connects those primitives is key.
Yeah, you can, okay. A punchy last answer.
I'll give a quick answer. I think you're half right, but I also think like linguists actually know a lot and it's largely neglected. I mean, to my right I have someone who's talking about semantics but not referencing the literature on lexical semantics and so forth. So there is a literature there, but it's not necessarily brought on board. Well, I tried to push you on that.
Okay.
I think we're out of time.
I think I'm gonna take the mic because it's time for Mike. And I'd like to thank the speakers they're going to end up fighting now in a bar. We had a spirited discussion about what is a boat earlier, and now we had a good discussion about data and theory. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Cognitive Neuroscience Society. Thank you for coming.